Yeah, so if you can't tell the difference between myself and Josh's voice, then that is completely understandable. This is Ben talking right now, and we hope that doesn't interfere too much with your listening pleasure.
And this is Zeke. I'm glad to be part of the podcast. Glad that Josh and Ben invited me to be on here. Glad to be here.
So a little bit of background in terms of The Way of Kings, which is the feature book of this podcast, is Ben and I have been longtime fans of the book series and have followed it pretty much since it was published. I have only read the book once or twice. It's been a few years for me. Ben just finished a reread, and Zeke has just read it for the first time. So we have a myriad of different experience levels with the book, and we thought it would be a good time to jump in and record a podcast.
Right, and obviously this is kind of starting our preparation for Stormlight 4. Fun fact about when we're recording it, Sanderson just, I think last weekend, was giving updates about his progress, and he just finished the first draft of Stormlight 4, which is currently untitled. So we figured that now was as good as time of any to start kind of preparing for that book to come out.
And I believe the release date for that is November 20th of 2020. I could be wrong on that, but I believe that's what I remember seeing. So it's just a few months out, or I guess 11 months out from the time of this recording, and we are excited for it. Okay, so let's jump right in. I'm going to read the Goodreads summary of the book. Very, very light spoiler warning. The whole beginning of this episode, we will keep it very light on spoilers. So you can kind of get an idea if you would like to read the book. If you have not yet, we will give you plenty of spoiler warnings before we start talking about spoilers. So onto the Goodreads blurb. I long for the days before the last desolation, the age before the heralds abandoned us and the night's radiant turned against us. A time when there was still magic in the world and honor in the hearts of men. The world became ours, and yet we lost it. Victory proved to be the greatest test of all, or was that victory illusory? Did our enemies come to recognize that the harder they fought, the fiercer our resistance? Fire and hammer will forge steel into a weapon, but if you abandon your sword, it eventually rusts away. There are four whom we watch. The first is the surgeon, forced to forsake healing to fight in the most brutal war of our time. The second is the assassin, a murderer who weeps as he kills. The third is a liar, a young woman who wears a scholar's mantle over the heart of a thief. The last is the prince, a warlord whose eyes have opened to the ancient past as his thirst for battle wanes. The world can change. Surge binding and shard wielding can return. The magics of ancient days become ours again. These four people are key. One of them may redeem us, and one of them will destroy us. Okay, so Zeke, what is your response to that blurb? Does it do a good job in summarizing the book? What do you think?
I think at this point in my reading, I have seen, yes, this blurb does do a good job at summarizing some of the key points you are going to see in this book, some of the key characters who are going to be part of very important events in the book. These characters that I think Brandon Sanderson has put a lot of work into. I think it does a good job, and it slightly introduces the magic system, but doesn't go too deep.
Yeah, I think I agree with that. I think that, if you were to just read this blurb without having any background knowledge on the book, you wouldn't know what surge binding or shard wielding is. And one of those things, you might not even know what it is until 3/4 of the way through the book. So it kind of sets you up for the a steep learning curve that accompanies this book. So if you're into kind of finding out what those words might mean, then you will probably enjoy the book.
Yeah, so I think that this blurb is interesting. I don't know if it does the best job at setting the tone for the story. I think that it kind of makes it seem a little bit more mystical than what the actual book entails. The magic system, again, light spoilers, is a hard magic system. It's not very hand wavy in the sense of like a Harry Potter magic system. And so this just seems like it's kind of mystical, whereas the actual magic in the book is much more hard magic.
Yeah. I also it's not clear who's writing this, who is we that are watching, it's written from an interesting perspective for me.
Yeah, I agree. I think I honestly think it's a C job in terms of the introduction, maybe a 5 out of 10. I don't think it does an amazing job, but it does do a good job in introducing kind of the 4 people that we start off the series following. We pick up a lot more along the way, but those are the 4 in that first book. Some other Goodreads information is this is a very high rated book on Goodreads. It has a 4.65 stars with over 250,000 ratings and 16,000 over almost 17,000 reviews. It's very highly rated on Goodreads. I think for a while it was actually the highest rated. So it's a well-regarded book in the world of fantasy, and it's definitely a good. Okay. So let's jump into a quick content rating. For those of you that are unfamiliar, we kind of go through and give a little bit of a rating in terms of like PG, PG-13 of different aspects of this book, just because it's kind of hard to find those ratings other places. So Ben, what do you think this book should be rated in terms of content?
Okay, so like for violence, I would say it's kind of a PG-13 rating for me. I would say that like some PG-13 movies, you're exposed to violence on a large scale. You know, you might see war and be forced to confront death and kind of the feelings around death quite a few times during the book, but it doesn't go into the gritty details of that so much. And so I think, yeah, like I would say a PG-13 rating for violence.
What would you say, Zeke?
I would say that there's a large spectrum to PG-13 movies. While one is barely scoots into PG-13, one is barely staying in there instead of staying out of the R-rated zone. And while the violence itself isn't necessarily graphic, there is a lot of violence. So I would agree. I'll say I'll disagree. I would say some of the violence does scoot into R. Some of it's a little gory, kind of like one bad ingredient might ruin the whole brownie. But since there's a little bit of that extra gory violence, it scoots all of it into the R zone for me. Okay. If that makes sense.
Yeah. I don't think that you're going to, if you've read a lot of, fantasy before, this is nowhere near as dark as like a Joe Abercrombie or a George R.R. Martin. The violence isn't at that level, but there's a lot of it. And Brandon Sanderson does not shy away from describing a killing. He doesn't go into a ton of gory detail, but he doesn't shy away from it. So I think that the violence is for sure the most content that you're going to get out of this book. I think you'll know pretty fast if it's too much for you. It's not like within the first 100 pages or so, you'll have an idea of if it bother you too much. Okay. In terms of the sex, Ben, what do you think?
I mean, there's nothing. There's, I think, a few cute scenes where you get some light flirting, and that's about it for this book. So there's hardly any romance and maybe one passionate kiss or so, but there's nothing big.
Okay.
I would actually disagree with that a little bit. I think some of it, I think there's a part in this book where it does describe a woman being naked from the top half up.
Ooh, I'm trying to remember that part now. Okay.
So
I could see that.
So some descriptions, not overly graphic though, right? Yeah. It's not you never. This is a book that you could read on the train, and nobody's gonna think you're some sort of creep.
It's not 50 Shades of Grey. It is. There is some detail in there, but it is not, getting heavy in the book at all. There is some flirting, but in my opinion, it's a little more than just, sunshine and daisies.
Yeah. In terms of swears, there's really not a whole lot of swears. Maybe there's some in-world swears, meaning like the Wheel of Time kind of popularized. They say swears that pertain to the world. I don't really want to ruin them for you because some of them are kind of funny. Beyond that, maybe damn or hell in there, but nothing crazy. So you don't need to worry too much about that. Okay. Any last thoughts on that content rating?
I think that's accurate.
I will say if you've read a series like Wheel of Time, it's about like Wheel of Time, I'd say, in terms of violence and sexual content and swears. It's about on that level. So if you've read that series or any book in that series, I think that you'll have a pretty good understanding. Okay, moving on. So now we are going to get into spoilers. So if you have not read the book and you are planning on reading the book, or you do not want spoilers, now would be a good time to go buy the book and read it. If you want to, I would recommend it. I think it's a great book. It is a large book. It is a long book, and it might not be the best first introduction to Brandon Sanderson, but it is a really good book. If you've read any of Sanderson's other books, I would highly recommend it. Okay, so let us start with the premise. So, Ben, would you like to introduce the premise for us?
Yeah, so to try and summarize the premise in a book like this that is kind of an epic fantasy is kind of hard. I would say just this book, you're looking at a young man named Kaladin, who's our protagonist, and he was trained to be a surgeon by his father, but he also has these inclinations towards war, and he's very good at fighting. And so you kind of have these two conflicting parts to him that kind of motivate his character throughout the whole book. And you see that kind of drive much of the story. And so I think that the premise is pretty strong in that regard, that it's kind of focused on this character who is trying to overcome his drive to fight and protect those that he loves, while also trying to help and heal people.
Okay, Zeke, would you agree that's a good summary of the premise?
Yeah, I think it's a pretty good premise with this surgeon turned warrior. I would say that a lot of the book is spent on him really deciding on who he is going to be. And that is one of those key themes presented in this book, is how your personal choice affects who you become.
Very nice. Yeah, I think that's a good premise. I think that the as a kind of broad thing, Sanderson kind of picks one person to be the protagonist, the main protagonist of the book, and so a lot of what we're saying pertains to Kaladin. I think that the premise is cool. It's a cool kind of unique introduction to this world. It's also kind of from the crown boot soldier perspective, although you do also get other perspectives throughout the book. But I say it's a strong.
Yeah.
Okay, the plot. The plot is kind of, I wouldn't say all over the place, but if you have not read a lot of epic fantasy before, it can get overwhelming, especially at the beginning of the book. At the ending of the book, I think that the pacing is a little bit better, but I do think that this book starts off a little bit slowly. I know a few people who have read the first few chapters and putting the book down because they kind of just get bored by it, but it has a big world to introduce.
Yeah. So I would give the plot, just looking at this book, I mean, I would probably give it a 6 out of 10, maybe. I think it's kind of buoyed up by the world that's been built and the characters that you follow. But I don't think that the plot is the strongest point if we're just looking at this book alone as a standalone book. So yeah, my rating for plot is 6 out of 10. I don't think we gave the premise a rating. I would say the premise is a strong 8.5 or 9. To kind of go back to that, but yeah, that's my rating for premise and plot.
Yeah, I would agree that for the plot, that the world building as part of this story is one of the strong points, but too much of a good thing can be a bad thing. I think with this world building, sometimes I found myself getting a little bit lost in Brandon Sanderson's world and wondering where I actually was in the story and what was actually going on. So while the world building is great and a very strong point, it also kind of turns into one of the book's weaknesses for me.
Okay, so kind of the plot is brought down a little bit by the slow-moving nature of the world building and setting. A little bit of background is this is the first of a total of 10 books. There's going to be kind of 2 sets of 5 books. So it has a lot of groundwork to do, but you can tell it is definitely the first book in a series. Okay, moving on to characters. Zeke, do you want to start this one? Let's start by focusing on our main character, Kaladin.
Okay, so Kaladin, in my mind, is kind of your classic protagonist. He's somebody who is very conscious of his actions. He wants to help those around him. He doesn't have very many, if any, evil or even mischievous notions. He just wants to focus on helping those around him. You see him throughout the book finding those who are in positions that are extremely challenging and difficult to deal with. And Kaladin oftentimes throughout the book focuses on trying to help them, and that becomes his drive, is helping them up the ladder per se. He wants to help them improve their situations. He wants to protect them. And so but he does go through a lot of ups and downs, multiple times. It's not just once. I guess he's not a one loop roller coaster. He goes through a lot of different things that I think are very relatable. I think Kaladin is one of those characters that many people could identify with. He is not idealized in some aspects. In some ways he is very kind of stuck to the protagonist side of things. He always tries to do the right thing, but as far as his challenges go, he seems to be very human. He's very relatable to how he experiences and how he suffers through those trials. And so I think that's a very strong part of Kaladin, and he really is, in my opinion, my favorite character in this book.
I think that kind of if we look at Kaladin as a character, I think he's one of the only characters that I've read in fantasy that is purposely written to have depression, kind of like chronic depression. And when I first was reading like Reddit reviews about it, and I was like, well, of course he has depression. He was like sold as a slave, and like all of his friends were killed, and like all these terrible things have happened to him. But on the reread that I just did, I realized that he kind of had a melancholy experience as a child. When we kind of hear him as a youth, he would go through these melancholy moods that his brother Tien would be able to kind of cure him of. And so it made me realize just how much of how well thought out that was for Sanderson to have kind of built out a character with depression and not stigmatized it and not glossed over it. I think that, I mean, it's awesome to have read a character that has that as part of his personality and his drive. So.
Yeah, I'll agree. I think it's really hard when you're writing a character with a trait like that to not have the trait be the character. I think that this it's easy to get pulled into just describing, in this instance, his depression, and everything is focused on that. But that's not how life is. That's not how people are. And I think that Sanderson does a really good job in this and not having his depression define him as a character. He still has a lot of other motivations and a lot of other reasons why he does what he does. I will push back a little bit on what Zeke said about him never really having temptations to do evil. Well, I don't think necessarily he has evil temptations. I do think that he has a lot that he has to combat with how he views like the Light Eyes, his relationship to them, his hatred of them. And I think that's an important part of his character that kind of leads him to make some poor decisions and have maybe some outlooks that he shouldn't have or needs to adjust throughout the book.
Yeah, I guess if we consider bias being a sin, then yes, he has a sin or two.
He kind of has that be a motivation for him to kind of, do some not so great things throughout the first book too.
That's true, but it's so small for me that I can't, I don't know. I feel like I just can't hold it against him when I myself have my own biases against people.
Yeah, and I think that those biases aren't unfounded either. Like the thing is with Kaladin, he looked up to the Light Eyes and he thought they're kind of infallible in his youth. And then like his first experience is the High Lord or whatever that comes into his town and totally just like destroyed his life. And then like he was like, okay, maybe that's just that one Light Eyes that doesn't really represent the whole. And then he looks up to Amaram, and then Amaram just kills all of his friends. So like, his biases aren't unfounded, but it's still something he has to work through. I agree.
Okay, trivia question. What was the Light Eyes name that came into Kaladin's town?
I knew you were going to ask this.
I think I know it.
Okay, let's hear it, Zeke.
It's Roshoni, Roshone.
I believe that is correct.
That sounds right.
Nice.
Yeah.
Very nice. Bonus question. What is the name of Kaladin's town that he grew up in?
I know this one too.
All right, Zeke, let's hear it.
Hearthstone.
Very nice. Very nice. Okay. Kind of a very Two Rivers-y if you're looking at Wheel of Time, or even the Shire, kind of just smaller town that is kind of coming out. Let's touch base on some of our other characters. We do not have to go quite as in depth, but let's talk about Shallan, the four that the kind of blurb mentioned. Let's talk about Shallan, Seth, Dalinar. Yeah, let's keep it. So let's talk about Shallan first.
Well, I think overall, I love that Sanderson, you could tell, really had these characters built out. He doesn't necessarily show that in the first book, but you can tell that there's been a lot of thought put into these characters, and each of them kind of has a lot of unique things about them that make them interesting to follow.
I would agree. And first off, but I mean with Shallan and with any other book that really has multiple core characters that aren't in the same place at the same time, and so their chapters don't include each other, it's a hard thing to juggle all those characters. And I'll be honest, I found myself bored at the beginning with Shallan's character of in the book of Way of Kings. Sanderson flip-flops between Kaladin and Shallan, and Kaladin's chapters at the beginning are interesting. There's a lot going on, and then it switches to Shallan, and it's a much more slow-paced, and it feels like you're watching an action scene in a movie, and all of a sudden they're walking through the mall, and then you switch back and it's the action scene again, and so for me it was a little bit of it's like you're letting gas out of my tank, when I would get to Shallan's chapters, and those would be moments for me that I would really consider putting the book down for the time, so and take a break from reading it, is when I would hit those chapters.
Okay, so I feel like maybe what we're hearing is that characters are strong, but pacing maybe not so much.
Yes, I would say that was what I would be saying in a very short sentence.
Yeah, I agree with that. I think we can kind of move through these categories a bit faster maybe. I would say that the characters are awesome, but realistically, this book could have been done in 500 pages instead of whatever it is, 1,000 pages. I think characters I would give like a strong 7.5, 8 out of 10, with a few standout characters being 9 or 10 out of 10, 9 out of 10 or 10 out of 10. But pacing, I was like Zeke, especially on a reread, you're just like, all right, cool, we're back to Shallan studying with Yasna in a library. Like, this is cool. I guess I just want to skip this chapter and go back to Kaladin. So
one really compelling part of Shallan's arc that I liked was her relationship with. Okay, you guys are gonna have to help me out with the.
What's his name? Dang.
He's the fake Ardent.
Yeah, with the Ardent.
Yes.
It starts with a K, I believe.
Dang, I need to do a better job of remembering names in these books.
Yeah, so I really liked her relationship with Capsule, and I thought that was an interesting dynamic / friendship, and I was pretty engaged with that. All right, let's go through. Let's just touch really quick on Dalinar. I really like Dalinar. You could tell that he had a troubled past and that he was trying to put it behind him. I thought it was pretty compelling. I thought it was a good way to kind of see foiled with Kaladin and kind of get exposed to different viewpoints of the world that you weren't getting through.
Dalinar, I'll admit, at first I was a little frustrated because I thought Sanderson just painted him the same color as Kaladin. But as you read further, you see that he's really not the same personality type at all.
And finally, Seth, I thought that his completely different culture was a really cool way to introduce him. I thought it was compelling to be able to hear this assassin that didn't really necessarily want to be assassinating people, but was really good at it and had the tools that he needed.
Yeah, see, I think I would push back on Seth a little, at least for this book. Like, when the Seth chapter came along, you knew what you're going to get. You're going to get this guy that didn't want to be killing, that was going to go kill people. So, like, for me, there wasn't much to his character besides just that. So I think Seth was probably my least favorite character in the first book.
Okay, fair enough. All right, let's move on to, so overall rating for the characters, you kind of gave a range between 6 and 10 from what I heard, Ben.
Depending on what character you're talking about.
Yeah.
I'd say overall, I would say 7.5, 8 out of 10.
Yeah, I would give a 7 for the characters in the first book.
Very nice. I would range more towards maybe a little bit higher, maybe an 8, just because of how many characters were introduced and how I thought that you had a good understanding of purpose and journeys were. Okay, let's move on to world and setting. And Zeke, I'm going to give you the opportunity to start us off on this one, because I know that this might be your biggest bones to pick with.
You are correct. So Brandon Sanderson he leaves no rock unturned per se with his world. He, with the different countries, with all the different plants, he describes the different animals, he describes the different plants, the different countries and their people, and he goes very much into detail with it. And it's not at the beginning, just in the beginning where he's trying to explain it all. It's very much detailed throughout the entire book. And for me, this was, like Josh said, one of my biggest bones to pick with the book, because sometimes I felt you'd be reading something in the chapter and I would get lost in what I would describe as this ocean of detail, and I wouldn't know exactly what was going on. I would lose the thread of the chapter and what the main ideas Sanderson wanted you to hold on to were. I would lose that in the details of those chapters sometimes.
Yeah, so I think I would agree with that. I think so. It's kind of like a wonky way to look at the book, and this is how Sanderson describes it. He describes each of these books as being 3 books combined into one that are separated throughout each of those books by interludes. And I feel like those interludes were sometimes super hard to get through. They were about like characters that you never seen before and probably weren't going to see again, and they're about parts of the world that you might not care about, and they would often happen after something super exciting, because that was how he set it up, which was definitely a stylistic choice. Like, you would have something major happen and you would be left like, oh, what in the world just happened? And then you would find yourself reading this interlude that you didn't care anything about. So I think that the world building combined with that stylistic choice of pacing would be something that you had to push through.
Okay, I'm going to disagree with both of you. It has been a while since I've read these books. However, I think that nobody besides maybe Robert Jordan has done as good of a job as establishing the world as Brandon Sanderson. While I agree, well, okay, I should say Tolkien in there has, for sure, he has a world built out. But besides Tolkien and Jordan, I think that Sanderson kind of takes the cake and maybe in some ways beats them out. And while that can slow down the pacing of the book and kind of interrupt the action, I think that when you're picking up a tome this big and diving into this world that is this large, I think that's kind of what you are signing up for. And so I think that, in my view, this is the best part of the book. But I really like it. So if you are not up for, these type of worlds being established and the time that takes necessarily, then I could see how you might not like it. But I thought it's probably the strongest part of it.
So I think, I remember being in a lecture with Sanderson when he was describing that they had like an internal Wikipedia page set up for Stormlight that like would detail all of the currencies and all of the calendars and all this information that obviously Sanderson cares a lot about and has put a lot of thought into, that the average reader cares nothing about. So yes, like, you're signing up for like a certain amount of world building, and I thought some details of it were amazing and other details just I couldn't care about.
Yeah, I agree. And I think there are 2 ends of this spectrum with world building. One is creating a world off of something that is already very, very familiar with us, like with J.K. Rowling setting up Harry Potter in London or in England in the 80s, where most of the world is something we already understand. And then the opposite is Sanderson and Tolkien, who are building this brand new world and have to describe every single detail. And while it's very creative, it's not everybody's cup of tea.
Yeah. You know what I will say, and this is like light spoilers for the 3rd book, I will say that the payoff came for me at the end of the 3rd book for this, but that's all I'm going to say about the world building.
And I will say, when you are comparing, this book to Tolkien, I think that's that's a really good thing. That's comparing him with arguably the greatest fantasy author of all time. And so it might not be for everyone. And if you are just in the mood for fast, epic, there's a lot of epicness in this, which we'll get to later. But if you're just in the mood for a fast story, then maybe not for you.
But the thing is, to push back on that, like, I feel like I forget how long exactly Lord of the Rings trilogy is, but I feel like all three of those books could fit into the first book. So like, how did Tolkien build such like a compelling world that you could really see? And he did it in like a third of the pages. You know what I mean?
Well, I mean, the plot of Lord of the Rings, is much more linear and not as, it's following way fewer characters and it's not doing nearly as much in terms of what's going on in the world. So, okay. Let's move on past that. I do think that if you like epic fantasy, if you have read The Wheel of Time, if that's how you're getting exposed to Sanderson is by him finishing The Wheel of Time, then you're getting something similar with the descriptions and with the building of. If you have never read this type of fantasy before, then it will be a hurdle that you have to. Is that something we can all agree on? Okay.
Yes, I would agree.
All right. So let's get to pacing. Ben, you alluded to kind of the way that Sanderson has chosen to lay out these books and how sometimes that worked for you, sometimes it didn't. What is your overall rating on pacing?
I think I'm going to go 6 out of 10 on pacing. I think that he did what he was trying to do really well, and I just didn't like what he tried to do with it. So 6 out of 10.
Okay, Zeke?
I would go even lower, like 3 or 4 out of 10. I'm going to be honest. The pacing in this book was extremely slow for me, and it seemed like it was stalled, in the air for 600 pages or something like that. It felt very long to me. And I mean, I read this book in a week. I blazed through it, but I remember during this experience that much of the time I was really frustrated with the pacing and with how slow everything was. And I felt at the end of every chapter, I'm like, when is something big actually going to happen? When is something going to change? And it took a while for anything really to happen. And the end of the book is great. It's a great ending. But I felt like it took so long to get there that I'm questioning myself, was it really even worth it at the end? And I would say a tentative yes, because it's a great story, but really, the pacing for me was really bad.
Okay. It's been a lot of years for me since I've read this, so I think that this is the part where I'm least qualified to speak on. But I remember the last few hundred pages of this book just being enthralled. And I think I read, the last few hundred pages almost one sitting. So there was a lot of buildup, but I thought that all the climactic scenes were done wonderfully. But I will agree that it's been a long time, so I'm probably just remembering, those very epic scenes that were very well paced. So, okay.
All right.
Let's do prose. So I'll start us off on this one. Sanderson, in a few lectures I've heard and seen, is he talks about his writing style as being like a clear window to where he is just trying to allow you to look through his words on the page to what is going on in the world. He doesn't use a whole lot of flowery or really, beautiful poetic prose like maybe a Patrick Rothfuss or a Tolkien does. But I think that allows you to be in the story. But if you're going here for a feat of literature in which you go through, poetry and amazing prose, then it's probably not what you're going to find here.
Yeah, I think I agree wholeheartedly with that. I do think that the ideas contained in the book are awesome. I feel like it's kind of shaped my worldview almost for certain things. Like, can you really help people by hurting other people? So I feel like the ideas that he explores are amazing, but they're done in the simplest words possible.
Yeah, there isn't a whole lot of metaphor or allusions in his writing style. It's very, I could say, I guess it's how you might think of how a man thinks. It's very direct with a lot of ideas.
So I think overall rating for prose would be, I don't know. To me, it doesn't take away from the book. Like, I've read some books that like I really can't stand how many times they say like a certain phrase. So I'll say I'll say a 6 out of 10 again, because it didn't detract from the book, but it didn't out either. So
I think that what this book benefited from was Tor doing an amazing job in editing it and making sure that none of no silly errors slip through or anything like that. You could tell that this is kind of their hallmark series, and so they put a lot of effort into making sure that the book at least is edited well, and you don't have a lot of, like you were saying, Ben, repeated phrases or things of that nature. Okay, so let's go over depth briefly. Ben, do you want to start on this one?
yeah, so I think that this is honestly what sets Sanderson apart from literally any other author that is writing right now, is the amount of depth that you can go into with this series. If you've never been exposed to the Cosmere or like Sanderson's universe that he's created, he basically has like all these books from Mistborn to Elantris to like all these different series that kind of all relate to each other, and you can read all of them or just one of them and be able to enjoy it equally as much. So there's like at least one character in the first book, and that is Hoyd in terms of the Cosmere, but he's called Wit in this book, that really kind of he kind of helps Kaladin along his path at a certain point that is crucial. But if you didn't know that he was a player in the Cosmere at large, that doesn't matter. So I feel like depth is amazing, and the fact that you can go as deep as you want or as shallow as you want, and you'll enjoy the book all the same.
All right, Zeke, let's hear it from you, because I believe this is your first introduction to the Cosmere and Sanderson as author, correct?
Yes, this is. I've had some people talk to me before about his other books and how there are crossovers within this Cosmere, and so I'm starting to get this idea of that Brandon Sanderson's books are similar to, you could compare it to the Marvel universe. You could make the statement that Brandon Sanderson's books are Marvel in the book world, with what's been described to me. Now, I haven't read the rest of his books yet, but I am interested in doing so, and I think I will be over the next few months here digging into more of the Cosmere here, and I think he's set up a lot of potential with the depth of what you could possibly do inside this universe that he has created.
Yeah, I think that those are both very good summaries. I would push back on the fact that you can enjoy it as much if you haven't read any of the other books. I think that, especially in the third book, some of the characters you really would want to be reading Warbreaker and Mistborn to really kind of understand some of the motivations. But it is definitely a standalone series, and you are not forced to read those. But I think it does increase your enjoyment if you do. Okay, so overall depth, I would say I agree with Ben that this is probably one of the strongest parts of the book, and I would say, yeah, probably one of the strongest in fantasy right now.
Yeah, 10 out of 10 for depth for me. It's amazing how much detail and thought is put into all the layers that are kind of underneath the actual story.
And if you doubt that, then go on 17th Shard and be careful of spoilers, but you will get sucked into many different rabbit holes. All right. So let us move on to our final point, which is epicness. Let's start with you this time, Zeke. What did you think?
All right. So I thought, looking at the book as a whole, the epicness could have used some improvement. The beginning, it hints at it, and it gives you kind of a taste, but then it doesn't give you quite any more of it. You might get another taste or two there, like here and there, as you continue throughout the 1,000 or so pages. But around page 800 or 900 is when Brandon Sanderson really does bring it out, and those 100 or 200 pages are really, really amazing. A lot happens in it. It's very it's very entertaining, and it sucks you right in, and you really don't want to put the book down during those 200 pages or so, because so much is going on, so much is affecting the characters you care about. They're very dire situations, but that one moment does not make up for the lack of any epic situations to me in the previous 800 or so pages before that real amazing ending sequence. So for me, I would give it probably a 6 or a 7.
Okay, I'm going to disagree with that because I read this book like for the first time around when it first came out, like 5 years ago? I don't know. It's been a long time. And there are certain scenes that I remembered in my head. I'm like, surely that's just how I envisioned it. And it was probably a little different. But when I did my reread of it, it was almost exactly the same. So those 4 scenes, I think, were one, when Shalyn was poisoned and had to kind of reveal that she had tried to steal Yasna's, I'm forgetting the name of the device, her soulcaster. So that was a super epic scene for me, a big payoff. Next scene, when Kaladin slays the shard bearer and is then kind of brought into a room, and Amaram kills all of his friends. Again, that scene stuck with me for 5 years, and I remembered almost every detail from it. So again, that to me was like a super epic scene. And the fact that these scenes stayed with me, and I really didn't get any more when I read them the second time, is a good indicator for how epic they were. Then, of course, you have Sanderson leaping over, kind of off of the bridge into a sea of Parshendi and totally kicking butt that's just as epic as you can get. And then finally, when Dalinar kind of throws down the shard blade to buy all the bridge bearers their freedom, you can't really get better than that. So those epic scenes, granted, most of them take place in the final 300 pages of the book, but to me, if I can remember those scenes with that much detail 5 years after I read the book, that's pretty awesome.
I would agree that those are epic scenes throughout the book, but I feel different about how epic those are. It's I would say the gravity of some of those scenes to me just didn't hit quite as hard as towards the end of the book when you have Sadious's betrayal of Dalinar. That for me personally really hit hard, and that was for me probably the craziest and most epic moment of Way of Kings.
Yeah, I could see that.
Okay. Well, thank you all for joining in. I believe let's go for our overall ratings. From what I remember of this book, and this is definitely nostalgia covering it, and definitely biased, but I would say this book deserves at least a 9 out of 10 in my eyes.
Okay, I'm gonna say after reading it years ago and then doing a reread, I'm gonna say 8.5 out of 10.
All right, Zeke.
I would say that for me, it's kind of like to get to all the really good details in this book, or in this series, you have to get through the first book, and it's not my favorite. As far as a standalone, I would say it's probably a 6 or a 7. But if you get through it and you get to books 2 and 3, and I'm thinking 4 will be just as good, it is very much so worth it. It's an amazing series so far.
Okay, very nice. Well, thank you both for coming on the pod, and thank you for giving us some details and some review of The Way of Kings, the first book in the Stormlight archive. If you like this episode, please check out our other episodes. And if you have any recommended book series or recommended episodes for us to do not hesitate to leave that in the comments or tweet at us, or however you want to try and get in contact with us. We want to hear from you. Thank you, and good night.